Now, the first subspecies for Glavinous, and technically only subspecies of the Fated Four, Acidic Glavinous, introduced in Iceborne. This monster is interesting. I do like that it switches up the Glavinous formula a bit and that its slicing attacks are different. Its tail is shaped like a long sword instead of a great sword, so it tends to do more poking attacks as opposed to big bludgeoning attacks. I do like its color a lot as well. So I'm going to put Acidic Glavinous on A tier. I'm going to put it above Gammoth, but sort of near the bottom. It switches up the formula enough to make the fight different, but I don't think it necessarily breaks into the upper tier of A. It's got a lot of competition among some more iconic monsters, in my opinion. Closing in on the home stretch here, we've got a few more brute types. Next up, we have the big flying mossy helicopter, Duramboros. Duramboros, which I think debuted in Portable 3rd? It has been a while since I played that game. Yes, Duramboros was introduced in Portable 3rd. This thing is a big sort of herbivore-looking brute-type wyvern. It's got a big hammer tail, and it's more or less kind of a slow monster. It'll try and ram you and trample you, and it'll smack you around with its tail. But as the fight gets going, Duramboros does a few things that a lot of people weren't expecting. I know when we first hunted it, and it did the giant spin to win move where it starts spinning at high speed and then goes airborne. Definitely caught a lot of us by surprise. The idea that something that big could move that fast and fly was pretty nutty and very memorable. I think Duramboros would absolutely hold up well in the current generations with some more up-to-date movesets. So I'm going to put Duramboros up here on A tier. I think I'm going to put it higher than Acidic Glavinous. The idea that they have this just big mossy mountain that can spin around at high speeds. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go look up someone fighting Duramboros and just see the insanity. It's great. The subspecies, Rust Duramboros, has a different shaped tail and more or less similar moveset, and you fight it in the desert. Overall, the subspecies doesn't do a whole lot different. It's pretty much a color palette swap with a few nuanced different attacks, but not too memorable. I'm going to put Rust Duramboros above Steel Uragon down here. Definitely not as memorable as the original, in my opinion. Breaking up the brute types, we've got Great Macau. Great Macau was the Great Blank type debuting in Monster Hunter Generations. And Great Macau is interesting because, like I mentioned before, the early game drones from the older games were very forgettable, the raptors. But the Great Blank types in later games, I think, did things a lot more dynamically. Great Macau was sort of this feathered, almost kangaroo-like creature. It could balance on its tail and fly around the arena at top speed, kicking all the time. Between its really bright color pattern and its decent challenge for an early game monster, I would put Great Macau on B tier. I'm going to say a little bit lower than Great Jaggy. Let's say... I'm going to say behind Ivory. Overall, they made this monster decently challenging and interesting to fight. So, Great Macau goes... Next up, we have what I consider one of the most iconic of the brute-type wyverns. We have Brachitios. Brachitios is fairly famous in that it was the flagship for 3 Ultimate, I believe. But the idea that you have a monster that, one, introduced Slime Blight, which would later become Blast, combined with the fact that it was something that punches you, which is already pretty outlandish for a sort of fantasy hunting game, but Brack is one of the most iconic monsters in the series. As a result, I was thrilled when I saw that it was coming back for Iceborne, and because it's one of my favorite flagships, Brack is going up here on S tier as well. I am going to put Brachitios above Gore. I don't know if that's really controversial or not, but the fact that this monster is such a frantic and aggressive fight, and its design and coloring are real pluses in my book, it's up here near the top. It's one of my favorite monsters. Always happy to see Brack in a game. Its variant, Raging Brachitios, especially in Iceborne, having done that fight a few times, takes all of the regular attributes of Brack and makes it way crazier. I think the variant doesn't rate as highly for me, even though it's definitely a more intense fight. I'm going to put it near the upper part of A tier, above Barioth. It's good, but I think the insanity of fight sort of takes away from the monster a little, but not enough for it to really be a detriment. Raging Brack is great. I just happen to like the regular version better because I have more fond memories of its debut back in the earlier games. Next up, we've got a monster that debuted in World. Another brute type wyvern. This is Anjanath. Anjanath is a pretty good early tier, higher difficulty monster. I've heard people refer to it as one of the first walls in the game for newcomers to World, and I think that's pretty accurate. The whole idea of this pink, furry T-Rex with these weird wing flappies and the nose organ that pops up sort of makes you think that it's going to be a pushover, and then it absolutely mauls you and lights you on fire. Anjanath, to me, is a pretty good example of teaching the players about difficulty curves. So I'm going to put Anjanath towards the upper part of B tier. It's definitely a good monster, and it forces players to get good in the beginning, because if you don't pay attention and learn, it will absolutely maul you. For Anjanath's subspecies, Fulgur Anjanath doesn't do a whole lot different other than giving it Thunder Element and a few new attacks. Things like its ability to inflict bursts around it, and the big sort of Psycho Crusher with the thunder around it. Definitely give it a decent challenge as a master rank target. I think I'm more a fan of its design than I am of its fight. So I'm going to put Fulgur Anjanath towards the bottom of B tier. I think I'm going to put it below Royal Ludroth. Again, if the fight was more interesting, I would probably rate this one higher. But to me, the biggest standouts, the design change, the sort of tiger stripe pattern, and the contrasting colors. I do like that a lot. So we'll keep Fulgur on the upper part of the tier list, the lower B tier. Next up, we've got another brute type wyvern that made its debut in World. This is Radoban. Radoban, or Edgy Uragon, is very similar in body shape and attack patterns to Uragon, but one of its main gimmicks is that it covers its body with bone armor, and as a result, it has a more interesting look than Uragon right away. And overall, its fight is fine. It's very similar in fight, it's just different in design. But I do like it better than Uragon, so I'm going to put Radoban one tier above. It's a mid-game target, so it's not terribly difficult. But the idea of something that wears bones is something that we've seen in the series a couple times. So overall, Radoban I think is pretty decent. We'll put it there. Upper C tier. Next up, we've got a monster that made its debut in Iceborne. We have Bombaro. Bombaro is a roaming brute wyvern. Interestingly enough, it shows up in all the locales, just sort of wandering around. It doesn't invade so much as it just shows up in every locale going about its business. The combination of sort of a big antlered moose type creature with sort of reptilian and mammal type attributes results in a pretty interesting design. I like Bombaro's design a lot. The fight itself is fine. It's an early tier monster that's decently difficult and teaches you about how hard things hit on master rank. I do like how it picks up parts of the environment and uses them as weapons. So I would say Bombaro is a high B tier monster. Let's put Bombaro... I'm going to put it after Najarala here, above Conlos. If you've never seen the Hamtaro parody that was done, I think it's NCH, for Bombaro, I definitely recommend checking it out. Alright, a few more. Next up, we've got the last group of creatures. These are the Fanged Wyverns. There's a few in this family. And the first one is Zinogre. And Zinogre, which made its debut as the flagship for Portable 3rd, is one of my favorite monsters in the entire series. I think I mentioned it when I got to this point in Iceborne, but Zinogre has been a staple for a long time since Portable 3rd and is fairly popular amongst the community. The idea of this lightning wolf that breakdances is very interesting, and its fight is always very dynamic and challenging. When they announced that Zinogre was going to show up in Iceborne with a sort of updated design and moveset, it was definitely a plus in my book. Zinogre is probably my second favorite monster in the entire series after Narga. It's up here on S tier. I love its design, its mix of colors with the sort of bright teal turquoise and gold, the silvery fur, and then the electricity, combined with its high-paced fight that forces you to pay really close attention to everything it does. Overall, it's just a great monster. I'm hopeful that it'll show up in future games and rightfully sits up here at the very top of the list in S tier. The deviant for Zinogre is Thunderlord Zinogre. This thing gives Zinogre some really interesting and somewhat cheap attacks. As a deviant, it's a pretty high tier difficulty, but I feel like Thunderlord suffers a bit from just being annoying in some cases. It has a lot of attacks that can just outright kill you without much effort, but it does look cool. It has a sort of gold color tint to it, and it has multiple tiers of enraged states and goes Super Saiyan. I would put it on mid B tier. I'm going to put Thunderlord above Arzuros and Red Helm over here. I really wanted to farm up the endgame gear for this thing in Generations, but it was such a pain to try and solo. And my friends and I tried hunting the upper deviant quests in a group, and it still destroyed us. Overall, Thunderlord's fine. It's a little bit annoying to fight compared to the regular one, in my opinion. Next up, the subspecies for Zinogre, Stygian Zinogre. The overall moveset is a little bit different with the dragon element. In the previous games, there were a lot of things it did with its Dracophage bugs and Stygian Zinogre. I like its design, and especially in Iceborne, I feel like they gave the fight a bit more depth. So I'm going to put Stygian Zinogre up here on A tier. It's not going to be super high near the top of the list, but overall, I'd say I rate it higher than Acidic Glavinous. I think the color combination is what does it for me. The fight as of Iceborne is good too. Overall, solid monster. Next up, we've got essentially the Great Blank. We have the first target, early target for Monster Hunter World, Great Jagras. Great Jagras is your introduction to large targets and teaching the player how to deal with monsters that hit back. I do like its sort of dreadlock iguana design. The fact that it can eat other things on the map and sort of go into steamroller mode is pretty interesting as well. As a pretty serviceable early game target, I'm going to put Great Jagras on B tier, kind of towards the middle. We'll put down here above Baroth. I'm going to put it below Puke Puke. Overall, Great Jagras is fine. It's a bit of a punching bag, but not quite as generic as some of the other early game targets, like the drones. And finally, we have another monster from World that debuted. We have Kuluyaku. Kuluyaku is a bird wyvern, and its main function is a slightly more advanced early game target, fought not too long after you deal with Great Jagras. Kuluyaku's fine. It's got a pretty inoffensive fight. It's got a lot of personality with this sort of big, wacky bird that digs things out of the ground and uses them as weapons in the fight. I'm going to put Kuluyaku on B tier. I think I'm going to put it below Great Jagras, or Great Royal Ludroth. I'm going to put it below Royal Ludroth here. I like its design, but its fight is really nothing that distinct to me. Alright, with that, we have finished ranking all the monsters in the tier list. Again, there's a handful of ones that were not included here. There might be some more that I missed from the series, but I tried to name the ones that I could think of in the earlier part of this video. This was a considerable undertaking. Looking at the clock now, we're at almost 2 hours. So this is probably going to be about 4.5 hours of talk about Monster Hunter tiers. What I'll be doing is I'll be breaking this up into increments. This is going to be a probably long-running series of episodes. Probably no more than 15 minutes at a time, because I don't know if anyone really wants to hear me talk about Monster Hunter for that long. But seeing as how it's my favorite series, I felt it was only right to do a ranking of everything as accurately as possible. What I will do when this series airs on YouTube is I will link this particular tier that I used in the comments. And if you find yourself bored with nothing to do and you want to rank all the monsters, I'd be interested to see what other people in the community think. Again, based on what we see here, this is just one person's opinion. A lot of it is very subjective, as tier lists tend to be. So again, I encourage the conversation, and feel free to come up with your own tier lists and send them to me. But that being said, this was definitely a long undertaking, but I enjoyed putting it together. So I will see you guys in the next video.